Hi, I'm Tim Zacharias with Cougar USA and your host of Building Value. My guest today is Senior Sustainability Manager with JLL, Julie Hendricks. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Awesome. I'm very excited about today's episode. We're going to be talking about net zero carbon, the SBTI net zero standard, and how JLL is helping their clients create plans to achieve their targets.
On Building Value, we go behind the scenes of building operations to showcase the people and products that make buildings work and the value they bring to the community.
Well, can you tell me about where you grew up?
I grew up in South Florida and on the East Coast in a little city called Deerfield Beach. It is just south of Boca Raton and north of Fort Lauderdale, if you know Florida at all.
Nice.
We had beautiful, warm water. And I left as soon as I turned 18.
Okay. So what did you end up doing after high school?
I moved to Chicago, went to the University of Chicago, and lived in Chicago for a few years, then lived in Thailand for a little while, then moved to Houston, then moved to Boston, then moved to Houston again, and then moved to Tucson. So we've been all around over the course of my life. And but I spend the most time in Houston, the majority of my life, really, over 20 years, and I love it. It's a great place.
But you kind of skipped over the cool part there. You said you went to Thailand for 2 years.
Oh, no, not for 2 years. My husband is Thai. I went for 8 months after I graduated from college.
I thought you said you would. Okay, cool. Nice.
But I didn't. I learned to speak a little Thai, and I've forgotten it all since then. Yeah. And I could even, by the time I left, I could read the newspaper a little bit. I don't know if you're familiar with the language, but they have, special Thai characters. There's 44 consonants, and I forget how many vowels. And so reading the newspaper was a cool thing. It was impressive.
Yeah, very cool.
I still remember my alphabet.
Well, that's awesome. So what did you, obviously now you're with JLL and you're in Arizona working on sustainability, but what did you study in college, and kind of how did you get to what you're doing now?
I studied art in college. I am a visual person, and I'd like to think I'm a creative person, and I did painting and collage, and it was super fun, but it wasn't practical. So after I graduated from college, I was mulling over what I could potentially do with my skills, and I decided to go to architecture school. So I went to the University of Texas at Austin for architecture school, and I graduated and practiced architecture for quite a while, about 8 years, and then staying in architecture, still within architecture, I switched over to sustainability, which is the best decision I ever made, and it's a perfect fit for me. And I have been doing I did sustainability on the architecture side for about 15 years. And then I had sort of an epiphany, and the epiphany was that I cannot make change at the pace that is required if I stay in architecture. And that is because we're working on one building at a time. We're putting a lot of time and a lot of love into a single building. Spending a lot of time attempting to persuade a client to do the right thing on that single building. And when you succeed, it's the best feeling in the world. It's awesome. But even then, you have still impacted a single building, and it's just the pace of change is not fast enough for the goals that we need to meet. We need to make decisive change by 2030. And I felt like I couldn't do it in architecture. So I was looking for a role in real estate. And so I was lucky enough to find this role at JLL. And in this role, I get to work on buildings at portfolio scale. So clients who are attempting to meet their decarbonization goals, our consulting is to help them figure out how to transition an entire portfolio to meet their goals, or not, how to divest themselves of some of their portfolio that is not going to meet their goals. And this is, I love this work, and it definitely gets me up early in the morning because I know that this is what has to be done to get to our goals.
Very cool. And I think it's an interesting path to start in the art world and then end up in architecture. I mean, it's still has the art kind of background, the creativity to be an architect and kind of start with nothing and create a building from scratch. But definitely can see the want to change into having a bigger impact, like you said, across an entire portfolio. But I think you were able to, it sounds like you're able to kind of take that creativity and experience from the architectural world and apply it to what you're doing now.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I feel it is great. It is a terrific background to go into sustainability. And I'm on the sustainability building side. So I'm taking my architectural expertise and applying it to sustainability. Yeah, so we definitely need people who are architects and engineers and you name it, civil engineers, landscape architects, to be devoting themselves to the decarbonization effort exclusively. And in fact, if you are such a person and interested in making that transition, there are a lot of opportunities right now. I would definitely encourage you to go out and take a look.
Sure. So can you talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing now with JLL and I guess the clients?
Yeah, you bet. So our clients are very large. My biggest client is a global commerce tech company that I'm not allowed to name, but that is a household name. And we have several other large, well-known clients, and they have committed to decarbonization goals, largely through an organization called SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative. And I would love to talk about that more a little later.
Absolutely.
And so we develop for them programs that will assist them in meeting these goals, and they really run the gamut. And it isn't just decarbonization. They're, for example, our large tech company, they also have internal water goals, they have waste goals, they have goals related to the health of occupants in their spaces. And so we do work in all of those spaces, trying to improve their building portfolios in those directions. And so it's great. It never gets boring because we're always doing something different. As an example, one of the projects we're doing now is a sustainable operations guideline. And so we are looking at all of the different systems within the building and a series of things, a roadmap of things. And this is how decarbonization works. You're coming up with a roadmap because you can't do everything all at once. You have to figure out what can be done and when, and how much is it going to cost at each phase. And that's going to vary depending on the kind of buildings that you have that are in your portfolio. So in our sustainable operations guideline, there's a first phase. These are things that you can do now, either for free or very low cost, and it should be done immediately. And then you have a mid-range phase. These are things that you have to do some capital planning in order to achieve. And then you have a long-term phase, and the long-term phase is, this is where we're getting really close to achieving our goal, be it, net positive water by 2030 or decarbonization by 2040. And I mean, if I'm honest, our clients have a long way to go. In each case, like they're all pretty much at phase one, where we're doing this stuff that's basically free. But if we don't have a solid capital plan for what's going on in the next phases, then we're really in trouble.
Sure. And it's interesting when you look at it that way, because all of this kind of stems from a couple of things, right? You have the main one being the Paris Climate Agreement, where we're trying to get to that net zero carbon by 2050. And when you see it or hear it laid out like that, you're like, well, that's way out in the future. I don't really need to worry about that right now, right? And it seems like it's way out there, and maybe I already have a building, not really something that I'm going to be concerned with. But when you look at the number of buildings that are going to exist, or looking at the buildings that are going to exist in 2050, the majority are already built, right? And so these are existing facilities that are having to make changes now to get there by 2050. So interesting to see it already happening now, for 2050.
Yeah. What kind of building are you in right now? Let me ask you.
So we have space in a tilt wall construction kind of mixed use industrial building.
Okay.
So nothing too fancy.
Okay, great. Well, tell me, the first question is, what do you think the lifespan of that building is going to be? Is it going to be around by 2040?
I would think so.
Okay. All right, so then imagine yourself trying to put yourself in a position where you are getting that building to meet the SBTI goal by 2040.
It's going to definitely need new AC. I'm just not, not a fan of the rooftop, rooftop AC units anyway. So be happy to change these out to something that's water cooled or geothermal or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, if we were advising you, and this is a building in your portfolio, we'd start with, okay, well, when was the last time you retro commissioned all your systems to make sure that everything is working correctly? Start with that. That's the easy stuff.
Sure.
Set all your controls and sensors, make sure that everything's working right. That's your low hanging stuff. And then just in case, maybe you haven't transitioned all your lighting to LED yet, you can move on to that. It's a relatively low cost step.
Sure.
And in one fell swoop, you're going to save a whole ton of energy with that. If you're a single story industrial building, maybe you need some skylights and you haven't added any. That could be a relatively cost effective thing to do and would reduce your lighting load. Okay, and then once you've done that stuff, then you have to move on to the things that you really need some capital planning for. And so you're not going to say that you're going to do those in 2022, probably. You're going to say, okay, we'll have enough money for that in 2026. And in 2026, we are going to completely replace the HVAC system. And so we need to plan for that now.
Sure.
But even then, so let's say you're trying to meet the SBTI goal. What that will mean is reducing your energy use to 10% of the amount that it is currently using. 10%.
Yeah, it's a huge number.
It's a radical change. So is replacing your HVAC system going to get you there? No, probably it's not. Very expensive, but still not going to get you there. So then let's say it's 2027 and you're operating with your very efficient HVAC system. Then what you need to do is think, okay, 2032, we're going to have to replace the entire tilt wall. Say we're going to have to replace those, or perhaps maybe we just need to add insulation to inside and out. We're going to have to do something to that exterior wall, replace all the windows. That's really expensive. And so we usually save that for the last step.
Sure.
And then the next step, or perhaps you did this one before actually in reality, is you're going to cover your entire roof with solar panels. And hopefully by the time you have done all these steps, and I'm sure I left out a few of them, that you have reduced your energy to the point where your building is using 10% of what it was using before. But you can see why it takes you to 2040 to get there and why you have to plan to get there.
Yeah.
Like it's just not gonna, I mean, it could happen, but it would take a huge influx of money if you hadn't planned in advance.
Sure.
And so that's the thing about the companies who are thinking, oh, well, wait and see. Let's just see if climate change gets bad. The problem is that when it's incredibly obvious to 98% of the people, it'll be too late for you to make these changes in any kind of cost-effective way. You won't have been able to plan for the major impacts. You will have what we call stranded assets. So these are buildings that are so outdated and performing so poorly that they no longer have value in the marketplace. And so if you aren't planning now, you are at risk of these things, and those are a major financial risk to your company.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at it from that perspective too, because you're saying, if you're, regardless of kind of where you are personally with your climate goals, there are going to be financial drivers in the market that are going to move your building to be devalued if you're not moving towards these kind of higher performance solutions or these energy saving solutions. And your building is not going to be attractive to the large tenants that you're working with in the market.
Right. You might not be able to lease it. You might not even be able to sell it. Like you might have to put in a huge amount of cash just to sell it. Or you just lose your investment entirely. It's stranded.
Yeah, it's an interesting, you kind of have the regulatory drivers on one side with the climate agreement, and then at the different municipality levels, maybe not so much here in Texas, but in California, New York, DC, we're seeing the more aggressive regulations towards these goals. But then you also have these kind of market and financial drivers, and kind of like what we've talked about before is that I think in Texas definitely we're going to see those market drivers be what's moving the needle here, but definitely in the markets where you have both present, things are going to be moving in that direction a whole lot faster than what it sounds like when you're talking about these goals being in 2050 or 2040.
I did a little bit of homework before, in advance of this meeting, I thought it would be fun to see which of the major Houston employers have made
It's a lot.
climate decarbonization commitments. And specifically in this case, I'm talking about the ones made through SBTI. In my opinion, will be the market leader, is already the market leader for decarbonization standard. And so what SBTI does that is wonderful is that it allows everybody who's saying that they have some sort of goal to be playing by the same rules. One of the issues in the past has been that companies would say, oh yeah, we're going to be net zero carbon by such and such date, but they weren't including all the emissions. In fact, if you're only including scope 1 and scope 2, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means, if you're only including those, for most companies, you are excluding the vast majority of the emissions that are associated with your business. So a lot of companies, particularly the oil companies, sorry to say, I know that is so important for Houston's economy, but particularly those, because it's so hard for them, were creating goals that did not include scope 3 emissions. And yeah, I understand why they did that. However, those goals were ignoring the vast majority of their emissions.
And you kind of touched on it earlier. So, you know, scope 1 being what's actually on your premise, like your direct emissions, correct? And so that's where, when we're talking about the built environment, trying to reduce those to 90% of current levels, and that's that 90% reduction that we're trying to hit for scope 1 emissions, which is extremely aggressive, right? I mean, it's going to take, like you mentioned, a lot of, it's not just simple upgrades, it's kind of a shift in the way that you would design or maintain a building to be able to get there. But can you expand a little bit on scope 2 and scope 3 and how those are impacting?
Yeah, you bet. So first of all, scope 1 are any emissions from some sort of fuel that is directly being burned. And in a way, everything gets back to a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are emissions resulting from electricity that you buy. So those two tend to be the ones that most people who are, or most companies that are reporting greenhouse gas emissions, those are the ones that they're using, and they're not too difficult to measure typically, because you're either buying fuels, and that's scope 1, or you're buying electricity, scope 2, and you have utility bills to be able to measure that stuff.
Sure.
So scope 3 emissions, that's the big and complicated topic. And it includes a whole bunch of sub things, but the major things are that it includes your entire supply chain. So like for you guys, for Cooker, your supply chain would be all of the different companies that supply pieces for your water treatment systems. I hope I'm characterizing your business.
Water control. Yeah, it's close enough. Water control system. But yeah, yes, absolutely. All of our manufacturers, we represent all the vendors yes, that would be part of our supply chain.
Yeah. And so I'm sure that when you're thinking about this, you're thinking, but we don't even have control over all of that. We just buy that stuff. We don't even know how they're making that stuff. Half the time, we don't even know where it's made. And you're right. And this is why scope 3 emissions are really, really hard. It's hard to keep track of them. It's hard to come up with numbers that are remotely accurate for them. And so this is another reason why companies need to start paying attention to this quickly, because if they haven't planned to start keeping track of their supply chain emissions, they're not going to be able to ramp up and do it in a year. It's going to take quite a while to be able to start keeping track of this stuff.
Sure.
There's been a really important regulatory change that has been announced but not created yet, which is the new proposed rule from the SEC.
I was about to bring that up. Yes.
You were.
Yeah, that's
yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And I don't have any inside knowledge about the future of this, but I've heard pundits saying that they think that the final rule may well be announced this fall. And so they're in a rush to create a climate disclosure rule, and it will be a big impact for lots of companies, because it will require them to report scope 3 if it is material, material to their business, meaning that their business either creates emissions, which like every like scope 3 is material to every company. In my life, I have never met a company for which scope 3 emissions were not material. So when they say if it's material, well, it is. And I have a slide, if it is worth showing, that shows like how big scope 3 emissions are compared to other types of emissions. So this first one that I'm showing is listed on the right are the different categories of scope 3 emissions. And this is a great little graph. Listed on the left are different types of companies and what the impacts of their scope 3 impacts are. So if we take a look at energy companies, which is a really big, important category, they're huge amount of their scope 3 emissions, the vast majority, and the reason their emissions are so great is because of this category 11, use of sold products. So they sell energy and people use that energy, and that is the vast majority of their carbon impact. And for a while, like there was sort of a silly argument, which was, oh, but we don't burn fossil fuels, you know, we just sell them, which is slightly ridiculous because, you know, like what would people be doing with those fossil fuels that they sell? It's obvious what they do with those fossil fuels that they sell. So anyway, the new SEC rule will require them to take responsibility for these use of sold products, scope 3 emissions. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal for them. Just measuring the emissions and then accounting for the emissions is going to be a game changer in that industry.
Interesting. So, I mean, essentially what that's saying is that almost everyone's kind of scope 1 is their scope 3, right? Because it would,
well, everybody's scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1, if that makes any sense.
True.
Like if you can imagine every company in the whole world doing carbon reporting, there would be a ton of overlap between all the different scopes. Because like if I'm doing carbon reporting, just say for myself as an individual, I'd have to report all of the fuels that I burn. And obviously there's overlap with that and with what Shell, for example, is reporting for their scope 3 emissions. And in a way, if every company in the world is reporting, that would be awesome because we'd have a lot better numbers, because scope 1 emissions are really, if you're the one making a scope 1 emission, it's much easier to measure. Sure. Whereas if you're trying to estimate somebody else's scope 3 emissions, that's very difficult to measure. So that's why the more and more reporting there is, the better off we all are in terms of understanding actual amounts of emissions.
That's interesting. And the proposed reporting by the SEC will, I mean, at least initially, I guess, would just impact public companies, correct? I mean, they're right, by and large going to be the ones that probably doing a lot of this on their own already. But that's where the initial kind of impact would be with the public reporting, and the public companies, they would do this as part of their quarterly and annual reporting packages they already do.
Yes, and that is correct, and you make a good point. So I had to look this up because I didn't know that there's something like 3,500 publicly traded companies in the US to whom this SEC rule would apply. And of that group, I'm not sure what percentage is reporting, but I do know that of the Fortune 500, 92% are currently doing some kind of sustainability reporting in accordance with one of the major standards. The major standards are like GRI, SASB, there's a few others, CFD, Carbon Disclosure Policy, CDP. Anyway, they call it an alphabet soup. There's a reason.
Yes.
But of the top 1,000, some recent research has suggested that 70% do sustainability reporting. And of 3,500 publicly traded companies, I don't know the answer, but my guess is it's under 70%. So one factor is that it would force the other 30% or more companies that are not reporting at all to start reporting. And then the other factor is that it would give consistency to what is being reported, because currently not all companies report scope 3. But the new SEC rule would require them to do so if scope 3 emissions are material, which they are.
Yeah, it's
in my
interesting.
opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting to see it put that way with scope 3, because I feel like a lot of the emphasis has been on the scope 1 and scope 2, where people feel like they have the most control, like you said. So to see scope 3 having such a big kind of piece of the pie in this reporting is interesting. But I guess the bigger question would be, how do you impact that? And as part of these goals, and maybe that's, talking about back to the SBTI standard, how does that play in and with your clients? How does that the scope 3 emissions play into all that planning?
You're talking about in the real estate business, like how do we address scope 3 in the real estate business? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Yes, I wanted to talk about that.
Well, sorry, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but yes, I didn't mean to jump ahead on the slide, but
yeah, no, that's a great topic. Absolutely. Let's move on to that next. But
okay.
Before we do that, I just wanted to talk about this slide really briefly. This is an index fund. And I don't know a lot about this index fund, but an MSCI ACWI investable market index covers 9,271 constituents, large, mid, and small cap representation across 23 developed markets. So we're talking about a whole ton of companies, a lot, and estimations from the index fund of how much scope 3 emissions are for all of these different companies. And so I thought this was really quite interesting. Scope 1 and 2 here on the far left, and then right next to it, scope 3 in the aqua color. You can see that the scope 3 is, maybe 3 times the amount of scope 1 and 2 together. So it just shows you how important this topic is. It's important that everybody understands what scope 3 is, and that if a company is neglecting it in its reporting, that needs to be called out. I'm with JLL, and so I thought it would be fun to take a look at JLL's commitment versus one of our major competitors, CBRE. So you can take what I have to say about this with a grain of salt since I'm with JLL. Okay. But so on the left-hand side, this is a screenshot from our sustainability report that was published in April. And one of the nice things that it does is it lays out all of the different scopes on a little chart on the right. And so one of the things you can see, and this is on the chart far left bottom, is that there's a category within scope 3 that is accounting for the vast majority of the emissions that JLL is responsible for. And that category happens to be the same scope 3 category that is the challenge for Exxon and Shell. And that is this use of sold products.
Right.
In our case, the sold product is our expertise, because we're a service organization in managing buildings. So JLL manages a lot of buildings, CBRE manages a lot of buildings. And so this scope 3 that is a part of our supply chain is the energy use of those buildings that we manage. Now, the challenge, which I'm sure you can immediately perceive, is that we don't own those buildings. We manage those buildings. And so the final decision about whether things get done with respect to those buildings doesn't lie in our hands. And yet here, right here, we're responsible. We have taken responsibility for those scope 3 emissions. In order for JLL to meet its goals, we have to reduce the use of energy in the buildings that we manage. And that's not an easy proposition.
Sure.
But I know that it's one of the reasons that JLL is investing heavily in attracting sustainability professionals like me, whose job is to take the buildings that are under JLL management and get them on this graph, get them on the path. And so the first thing you can see from these two side-by-side charts showing the carbon emissions for JLL and CBRE is that we're not meeting the goals. And the reason, if you look at the data in the tables, the reason we're not meeting it is because of end use of sold products. Essentially, we're not meeting it because our buildings are not meeting it, the buildings
Sure.
that we don't own. And so what our challenge is to get those building owners on board with hitting the decarbonization targets. Unless we can find a way to do that for buildings we don't own, we're not going to make our goals.
That's interesting. And I was, I looked at the press release that JLL put out recently, making the commitment to the net zero standard through SBTI. And I thought it was really interesting, like you said, that the majority of the kind of work is in that scope 3. And it just initially in my head, I'm like, oh, well, it's JLL. I'm sure it's all scope 1 that they've got to reduce. But that being a very small percentage of the overall reduction, like you said. So to see it kind of play out that way was surprising to me, that it would end up in this scope 3 category.
Yeah, I did the math, and this use of sold products scope 3 emissions is 50 times greater than any of the other values in our chart. So it's serious. Like, that is the main one that we have to get in line.
Yep.
The others are important and symbolically important, especially the product for the projects that we actually own. It's symbolically important for them to be meeting the goals, and they are. I mean, they're on track to meet them. They haven't met them yet. Yeah, but this is our challenge. It's clear.
So this is I guess a shift in not only internally for JLL saying we're going to meet this standard, and like so we're going to have our own buildings meet the standard, but we want our clients we're going to help our clients meet this standard as well. So, you talked a little bit about that in working with your kind of clients and things like that. So are you mostly focused on their scope 1 and scope 2 reductions when you're working with your clients?
I would say
their scope 1 and scope 2, which is your scope 3.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that is fair to say. Yeah, I mean, we spend on the energy side, we spend the majority of our efforts thinking about operational energy. So that would be like the electricity and any fuel use you have in the building, which would be like any like gas-fired boiler or anything in the building that's directly burning fuel. Yeah, so on the energy side, there's that, but we also have a significant scope 3 emission that we help our clients with, and that's embodied energy.
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. As buildings get more efficient on the operational side, the amount of energy that it takes to manufacture, transport, and install, and then at their end of life dispose of all the materials in the building, that is called embodied energy. And that embodied energy becomes an important proportion of the total energy that a building is responsible for. As it becomes more efficient, we found that embodied energy can become as much as 50% of the total for a given building. So embodied energy is something that our clients have to track as a part of their decarbonization pathways. Which whenever I'm thinking about this in my head, what I imagine these lines, like what you can see on this slide, I imagine the roadmap lines, like embodied carbon is going to have to reduce on a schedule, just like all the other types of emissions that we're responsible for.
Interesting. So, I mean, if you're trying to reduce that, is that, trying to look for materials or pieces of equipment that are going to have a longer life cycle, or easier like disposal cost? I mean, what is it that's going to help you drive that down?
Okay, so the answer to all those options is yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, but a lot of it has to do with the material itself.
Okay.
So for example, wood is a low embodied carbon material. It creates less emissions over its life cycle than, say, something like concrete or steel.
Okay.
But both concrete and steel can be made in ways that greatly reduce their embodied energy. So for example, one of those ways would be to reduce the amount of energy used in manufacturing that product, which a lot of companies are doing. For example, the manufacturers of carpet are early leaders in this arena, have come up with ways to manufacture their carpet in such a way that it is actually carbon positive. And I'd like to give a shout out to Interface for really innovating in this space. That they either sequester or avoid more carbon in the making of some of their carpet products than they emit. Which is, if you're a company that is keeping track of your embodied carbon, that's a big deal. That's going to start to become extremely attractive. And yes, that is a thing that we are recommending to our clients and is happening. And let me ask you, in your business, have you had anybody start asking for environmental product declarations for materials that you guys represent?
I can't think of anything specific like that yet, but I do know that like when we've done projects for, like, say specifically the city of Houston, their requirements are much greater than a lot of the other places that we work. So I would, especially with some of the climate goals and other things that I see the city of Houston working on, I wouldn't be surprised if that makes its way into that. But I can't remember seeing that specifically. Not that it hasn't happened or it won't happen, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me to start seeing that. And you know, for us, we'd be kind of dependent on our manufacturers in a lot of ways for that. And I think, you know, Grundfos is probably one of the world leaders in sustainability with the way that they kind of operate their company and with what they build. And IntelliHot, you know, right up there, Tower Tech, you know. So I feel like we've got Wahaso, a lot of our manufacturers that would be, you know, easy to report on some of those things.
And absolutely agree on the Grundfos front. And so this is something that you will see clients start to ask for, is these environmental product declarations. The key piece of information these days that we're looking for in there is the global warming potential of a given product. That is the embodied energy that we've been talking about.
Okay.
And so they would like to be able to say, this water system that we just purchased has this amount of embodied energy. Not every manufacturer is ready to say so. This is, again, this is a complicated, in-depth topic all on its own. It would be fun for you to bring on an embodied energy expert to talk about it. And so companies have to gear up and start producing these, because the biggest corporations in the world are starting to ask for it.
Sure.
And so, and we've already started writing RFPs that require these environmental product declarations. So if you haven't seen it yet, it's coming down the pike for you pretty soon.
Interesting. I mean, it sounds like basically the next level of like the Energy Star kind of program, right? Instead of it being like getting an energy rating for how efficient it is, it's essentially like a total embodied carbon rating. It's kind of what
Yeah,
like.
it's another facet, and it is certainly possible to examine a product from both angles, both its like operational carbon relationship, and I know you guys are big on that and talk about that a lot, as well as its embodied carbon relationship, so that when you're pitching this to clients, you can be like, this is an overall from an emissions standpoint, like the best product you can get on all the angles that you look at it.
Okay, so kind of back to your slide here. I mean, it looks like both JLL and CBRE have the largest, the use of sold products being a big driver of the scope 3 emissions, and scope 3 being the largest. So have they, I guess y'all are on similar paths to the net zero here? Potentially.
I would say our long-term goals are the same, and that would be this 90% reduction by 2040. But with SBTI, you also have to set near-term goals. And then the near-term goals have to align with a bunch of rules that they give you. And it's all published publicly on their website. I just downloaded an Excel file of it 2 nights ago and was looking at the different ones. And CBRE's near-term goals are actually in different terms than JLL's near-term goals. And that is allowable. Like you are allowed to set any near-term goal that is along the path to your long-term goal and meets their other requirements in terms of addressing all the different scopes appropriately. So I don't know if that answers your question, but sure. Yeah, SBTI evaluates your goals, and they evaluate all the data that you put into them, and then they approve them or don't approve them.
Gotcha. And so I was looking at the SBTI website, and if anybody's interested or wants to learn more about it, and just Google's SBTI, and it comes up pretty quickly. But there's a lot of companies that have made public pledges on their site that are that are making this commitment to net zero, and you can kind of search and find out who's on there. There's also quite a few that are involved in kind of the sector guidance, I believe they call it, and that's kind of broken down by different markets, whether it's manufacturing or buildings for us, things like that, where they're working on specific guidance for getting people towards that goal. And I saw JLL is on that list.
Yeah, there is no
like,
sector specific guidance for real estate yet. It's supposed to come out next year, and we are like waiting with bated breath to see what it's going to be. That'll be extremely interesting.
Yeah, it's I think, but you've already kind of talked about how you're applying it now, and I assume it's going to follow, somewhat similar guidelines to what y'all are doing now. But if somebody was interested in saying, look, I've got property now, or I'm not really sure where to start, what's a good place for people to start down this path? Because I think talk about all the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 can kind of be overwhelming. What's a good place for people to start in this process?
Okay, this is going to sound really crass, but I'm going to say
you should call JLL. You should call Julie Hendricks at JLL. And
well, yes, that it's not simple, and that you will need professionals to help you. I believe that it would help you to get on your path a lot faster and better if you hire somebody to help. But I mean, the first step is, if you haven't started doing this already, is that you need real data so that you know what you're working with. And a lot of companies aren't even in a great position to know exactly all the energy, for example, that all their tenants use. In our research, we found that oftentimes they have no idea how much energy their tenants use. So just that project of attempting to find all the utility data that is associated with your emissions, like, start with that right away. You don't need to hire any advisors for that. There are probably people working for you right now who could help with that. So I certainly recommend that for any building portfolio owners. And then the next step, which probably would be easier if you had an advisor, but maybe could be done in-house, would be to study the rules, they call them the criteria that SBTI uses, and try to figure out like what parts of that apply to you. Like, if you look at the list of all the things you're supposed to study in scope 3, every business is different. But you can see where you're going to have to start collecting information, and what's going to be a challenge for you. For example, for your business, probably like all the supplier information might be your biggest challenge. So that you have to start collecting information about the, for example, the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of your suppliers. So you could start asking them, are you keeping track of this? And would you be willing to share that information with us, or some version of that information with us? So I guess that's the advice I would have. And I think that while this SEC rule applies to publicly traded companies, of which there are only about 3,500, the market forces that are causing companies to do this will apply to smaller companies as well, and will be important for every size company in the long run. And any company can be stuck with a stranded asset if they're not paying attention to meeting these goals.
Yeah, and like we talked about before, I mean, if you're a owner of a Class A high-rise commercial office building, I mean, your targets are probably going to be those larger companies anyways, right? I mean, you're going to have other tenants that are going to fill out the space, but as much as I would love to say like small companies like us would be able to be the anchor tenant in a high-rise office building, that's just not going to be the case. Right. So, especially if the SEC rule gets rolled out, but even without it, I think between corporate ESG policies that are already out there, these net zero commitments that everybody's making in that space, I think you're going to see that demand for the built environment for those commercial buildings to be moving in that direction, so that they are confidently able to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
Right, 100%. And the companies that have started down that path today or sooner than today will be in a much better position to be able to get the data and report on it as required. And we actually we haven't mentioned this yet, but there, the reason 92% of Fortune 500 companies are currently doing sustainability reporting, climate disclosure related reporting, is because investors are demanding it. And that's a market force that small and medium-sized companies will be affected by as well, that it will start impacting their ability to get capital to run their business. And in instances already has.
Yeah, that's it. You know, like I said earlier, it's really interesting to see kind of the combination of both these market and financial forces and the regulatory kind of pushing things in the same direction. And you know, here in Texas and in Houston, definitely feel like it's going to be those market forces that are moving things, which is fine in many ways.
Yeah, let's talk about it, because I want to tell you about the Houston market.
You know, it might actually happen faster here, being market based more so than regulatory. And I saw a headline the other day related to the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever it's called, that's coming out of Congress, and you know, in my head I'm going, man, this is there's a lot of stuff around it, and all this hype, and I was like, you know what, I feel like the only, in terms of like for us, where we could impact, where it might be trickle down, where we could see an impact with doing scope 1 improvements through the type of equipment that we provide. I'm like, I feel like heat pumps are the only things that are gonna be mentioned, and literally like 2 headlines down, it was like Inflation Reduction Act, you know, be a boon for heat pumps. I'm like, heat pumps
so
are
true.
you know, it's like, yes, they're great, but you know, if we're talking water source heat pumps, but I'm like, you know, they're not the be all end all for you know, getting to net zero. So I just thought that was kind of funny.
I know, that is great. And one thing I want to make sure to say before we get off is that, sure, the climate change is a huge risk and a thing that we're very worried about, and could greatly decrease the livability of the planet. But there's a silver lining, which is that there's opportunities here too. And so the opportunity that JLL sees is that we can become like the company that is the most expert in reducing this scope 3.11 use of sold goods, and such that building portfolio owners will be like, oh, well, clearly they're the ones who know how to solve this problem that we all now have. So it's a tremendous business opportunity, not just for JLL, but for everybody, for you, and for everybody who's listening to this right now. And so it's, when you do reporting on the task force for climate related financial disclosures, you're reporting risks and opportunities. And so there's significant risks and also significant opportunities. And so it's not all doom and gloom. There's a good side.
Sure. And you know, I'd like to think I'm an optimist, and I feel like, you know, ultimately we're going to end up with, especially when we're talking about the built environment, we're going to end up with better buildings that are more comfortable, you know, longer life cycle of equipment, things like that. I mean, you're going to end up with a better product in the end, in addition to all of that. So, you know, that's kind of where we are pushing that high performance solution. That's kind of that triple bottom line that we've talked about. So definitely feel like there's that opportunity, like you said.
Okay, so of the top 10 employers in Houston, 5 of them have set a science-based target. 6 of them are currently doing reporting. The one that has not set a science-based target through SBTI is, you could almost guess, is Shell.
That's surprising.
Well, Shell has been reporting for a long time, and I've actually had friends who work on their sustainability side. They are serious. They're really trying to do things from a sustainability standpoint, but they have the significant problem that we saw in that slide of scope 3 emissions and the use of their sold product. Because the target requires them to account for their scope 3 emissions. That's a hard problem. And the hard part of the problem is that they can't get there and continue with their current business model. And that's harsh to say, but their business model will literally have to change in order for them to meet the SBTI requirements. And they would have to transition to renewables in some sort of significant way, and significant more than as they have done. They have a renewables part of their business. And I don't know much about Shell's business, and it would be great for you to have one of those Shell sustainability folks on to talk about that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting, because I mean, we've done projects with Shell that are, water recovery and things like that. And I feel like it's I mean, maybe not surprising to hear, but the energy companies in general seem to be embracing the renewables and having a larger focus on them and things like that. And we've been able to work with a lot of them in their kind of corporate environments, not necessarily their production facilities, but definitely feel like that they're kind of moving that direction. So it's a little surprising to hear that. But yeah, if anybody from Shell wants to come on and talk about it, I'd be more than happy to talk to them.
I check in with my friend. I wonder if she's still there. I bet she'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Okay. So the other ones, just to name them for fun. Okay, so the 5 of them that have created commitments under SBTI are Schlumberger, United Airlines, Kroger, McDonald's, which is the number 5 employer in Houston, and Walmart.
That's surprising. Okay.
So I thought it was a great list.
Unexpected,
very exciting.
Some unexpected names on there. Yeah.
The other major employers that are not doing so are the healthcare companies. And my feeling about it is it's the size threshold. They are doing things with sustainability, but they haven't been required to report yet. And in time they will. I don't doubt it.
It is. Healthcare is an interesting one, and it's just an interesting kind of market for this. And because for them, they're balancing the operation of the healthcare, right? Like they don't want to sacrifice the operation of the hospital or their ability to care for patients, and so it's I think a little bit more difficult for them to make some of these changes and commitments. And so there are, I think Green Health is the name of one of the standards that's maybe a kind of a variation of like the well building, kind of along those lines. But I think they are looking at sustainability. They're looking at their EUI, things like that, but I haven't seen, ESG or net zero carbon been referenced by a lot of the healthcare institutions yet. But I mean, they're definitely, in talking with some of them, they're definitely aware of them and wanting to say operate the built environment in a more sustainable way. But there's less ability to compromise with what's going on inside the building. Yeah,
less flexibility. I think you're spot on in all those comments, and that they are gonna have to innovate. If there's any chance of meeting, for example, SBTI targets, they're gonna have to innovate.
It's going to be tough. I mean, I think they're going to have that, like, if they're able to find some of those solutions that can still maintain the environment that they want in a more energy or water kind of conscious way, or longer life cycle equipment, things like that, that's going to help them towards those goals. But, I completely understand where they're coming from with, having, patience and other things going on, and not wanting to sacrifice that. So
yeah, and if we're their patients, we don't want them to sacrifice that either. So
not at all.
I get it.
100%. So yeah, it is. And I think some of the public institutions have, like schools, K through 12 school districts, things like that. They very energy conscious, and they own and operate their buildings, so they're very interested in the life cycle cost, but not seeing those sort of kind of targets or anything from those types of groups either yet. But
yeah, that's true. Public entities haven't had a need to set targets, but there are regulatory pressures that affect them as well. And frankly, when I think about schools, like schools have really been a leader in the net zero carbon movement, despite the very tight budgets they're often on. Mm-hmm. And so when you see that, it makes you realize that if schools can do it, a lot of us can do a lot more than what we're doing.
Yeah, and it's, the more that we've worked with school districts, I feel like you kind of have this impression that, it's not going to go that direction, that they're going to, like you said, be on a tight budget, and that's going to be a constraint for them. But like I said, own and operate these buildings for a long time. So they want, I think they're really conscious of what goes into them in the beginning. So I think you're seeing it already a lot in the Houston market. When I was first doing a lot of research on this, didn't really think it was going to be something that was in Houston or Texas right away with, kind of our regulatory environment here. But through the kind of financial pressures and other things, I mean, it's definitely already here with the large companies that you've already talked about, and you have companies that operate in other parts of the world that have different regulations, and they want to be consistent across their portfolio. So definitely something that we're seeing a lot here in the Houston market, towards these net zero carbon goals, ESG goals, sustainability in general, all of those things. So yeah, I think it's something that is, if it's energy capital of the world here, I think hopefully we'll move towards that kind of energy efficiency capital. It'd be nice to be able to have that movement here. So we're happy to play our part in that transition.
And one thing we know is that the expertise is in Houston.
Mm-hmm.
Like this can happen, and the financial pressures all apply in Houston as everywhere.
Yep, absolutely. So anything that we haven't covered today that you want to talk about, or maybe any other advice for people that are kind of along this journey that you would want to impart on them?
Right now is a really good time to be a sustainability professional, because the people who have looked at these graphs, some of the ones that we've looked at, can see the writing on the wall, which is, if you don't turn this into an opportunity for your company, you are probably turning it into a liability for your company.
Sure.
And in order to avoid that, you need sustainability professionals, or you need to turn into one yourself. So I guess I would say, if there's anybody out there who's ever considered turning your career in the direction of sustainability, this is the best time I have ever seen to do that.
Yeah, it is. I've used that same kind of logic too, that, hey, this is, is this all a burden that now we have to, reduce scope 90%, scope 1 by 90%, all these things, or is it an opportunity to improve and get better and to do those things? So, like I said, I'm like to think of an optimist. So I see it that way as an opportunity. So 100% agree with you there.
I can see that you do see it as an opportunity.
Yeah. No, like you said, I mean, we're, especially being in Houston, you have that, that we're self-proclaimed energy capital of the world, right? So I'd like to keep that title here in Houston and, help along the way. So
yeah, keep the title and give it even more depth than it's had.
Yeah, absolutely. So Julie, really enjoyed having you on. I know it's, appreciate you sharing what JLL is doing specifically with SBTI, and I learned a lot about scope 3. I think initially kind of coming into it and looking at it, I'm like, scope 1 and 2 is where it's all about. We're not too worried about scope 3, but it's really interesting to kind of see those charts, see those graphs, and how big of a piece of the puzzle that scope 3 is, and what y'all are doing to tackle that. So appreciate you coming on. Thanks for sharing that.
It's my huge pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Tim.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks for coming on the show, and really enjoyed it. And I hope everyone that was listening or watching today also enjoyed the episode, and look forward to seeing you on the next one of Building Value.
Thank you.